Fellows. So we have a real treat, Dr. Kimberly, who's the head of the CCTS, among other honors and accomplishments, will be talking to us about his career journey. So for those of you who have not been around for very long, we started this, I guess, last year, talking to people around campus and to hear about how they wound up in the positions they're in and what their journey was like along the way. Thank you, Dr. Kimberly.
Thanks. So I'm going to move up here if I might, and I'm wearing the mic just in case anyone comes in. So I was asked to be here at 8 o'clock this morning, and now I know what at least the next few minutes are going to be about. So what I'd like to do is make a couple of comments about one way to think about it might be a career journey, but I might frame it a little bit differently. Depends a little bit on how you conceptualize when a career begins. Because as I was thinking about it, actually over coffee earlier today, I think there's a thread that probably goes back at least to high school and can carry through. So what I'd like to do is make a few comments about that. What I see is things that have been seminal. I have two slides I want to show you. One that pulls some information from a book that I think is very interesting, and another sort of a concept that within the CCTS we're talking about. And then after that, this isn't going to take very long. Then I'm totally open to talking about whatever it is that you would like to talk about. Part of what I'd like to get from this is your suggestions about what we collectively could be doing to help foster the development of careers in investigation, really across the spectrum of the T. So, a couple of comments. I don't know what, as each of you reflect on what things were like a number of years ago, but over my first mug of coffee this morning, as I was thinking about it, probably the initial seeds for a career in academic medicine go back to just a lot of curiosity about how things work, which was evident in high school. Now, there are lots of sort of cheesy little stories about how we did that, or what reflected that. But probably the thing that comes to my mind is actually a person who was a teacher. I think now we might try to map to the term mentor. I'm going to suggest a different word for that, even though I know we do lots of mentoring. I actually have a somewhat different view of that. But it was a teacher in biology who just loved what he did. And Mr. Brown has had a durable impact on me that I certainly didn't realize when it was happening. Didn't realize for quite a while. But if I were asked to go back and say, well, Bob, when did you have a sense that asking kinds of questions, curiosity about how things work, I'd map it back to that. And that was early in high school. I think then the second step is probably notably mapped to some experiences in college. I don't know whether any of you, when you were in college, had either the opportunity or in fact the requirement to do, I'll just call it generally a project. But the university that I went to, we were required to do a senior thesis. And a senior thesis counted 2 courses. So this was a non-trivial exercise, and we were given extraordinary latitude to figure it out. do whatever we wanted. A very accessible faculty, obviously some more enthusiastic about your projects than others. But there was, in retrospect, the opportunity there and the expectation was to take a number of the things that had been learned in the more classically structured classes and to turn that into an exercise, a program, and scholarship. If there are questions, either I'm not sitting where I can see the screen, so Carlos, I'll leave it to you to monitor.
No, I was just listening to.
No, I understand there's some people up there, but sometimes chat boxes appear back there. So the that experience was really probably the single most formative experience for me. And you probably know some programs when they're interviewing for graduate students, one of the important things they look for is whether there's been a significant experience or experience in investigation of any sort, and or project that had to be part of the undergraduate experience. I happen to be very lucky in mine because I was able to tie it to a summer job that I had. So I sort of daisy-chained a summer job in my senior thesis. It required that I do some things that I had never done before, and I sort of had to learn these. So it was both the opportunity, I'd like to think it was successful, but it was the opportunity for me to do something on my own, figure out whom I had to connect with in order to get it done. You might ask, well, what am I really talking about? At that point, power in computers was just beginning to take off. IBM had a brand new system called the IBM 360, and I had to teach myself how to do that. Now, if you know anything about computers, I've also just dated myself as to when I did this project. So it was more than a year or two ago. But I became a programmer and ran the 360, at least on the weekends when I could get free time as a student. The other thing in retrospect that I didn't realize at the time is that project did something that's very consonant with the goals of the CCTS. And that is I took knowledge that was and data that were being generated in one domain and moved it to an entirely different domain to come up with an idea and then the implementation of that idea that I think today we would classically call translational science. Now, it wasn't called that then. I didn't know that's what I was doing. But it's actually a very interesting example of taking a project where I frankly was a research assistant working on a social science project, but getting some data about human activity, putting a biologic frame on it. So it was almost like bringing certainly a different perspective, if not a different language, and then doing some analyses that actually supported a hypothesis about biologic rhythms and human behavior. So I'd like to talk about two other things and then look for a couple of themes. Then I'll talk about the more classic career. Okay, you're in medical school, what are you doing, that kind of stuff. I had the opportunity after college to do some graduate work. And as part of the graduate work, you had to, after a couple of years, you had a choice, at least at the university I was at that point. You could either take a whole series of tests, which seemed not terribly appealing. Or you could do a research project. I mean, that to me was a no-brainer. And so I chose to do a research project. And I bring that up for a couple of reasons. Sometimes, one, the opportunity to do research just appears. It's not something you can necessarily plan. Like there's a little bit of opportunism in all of this. And it seemed like a good opportunity to avoid those tests. But the other is it represented yet another change in at least content direction. So in that first project I mentioned, I took some data gathered by a social science project, put it into a biologic frame, made some inferences about human behavior in relationship to biorhythms, biologic rhythms. In this next project, I decided I was going to be a neuroscientist now. I'm not now, but I thought I was then. And I had the distinction of probably becoming one of the world's experts, literally, in the function of the pigeon's vision system. Now, being the world's expert in that was not a high bar. There were probably only 3 people who cared a whit about the visual system of the pigeon, but it was sort of a cool new technology at the time, being used in other model systems. And my tutor and I took that. He was one of the other world's experts. He was interested in birds for some reason. And so we did that, and I became, at least for a while, a neuroscientist. That was another formative experience. One, it was fun because I reinforced my own interest in sort of discovering things and trying to understand them. But it was also formative in the sense that after that experience, I decided that was not what I wanted to do. And why? You said, well, gee, I just said I enjoyed it, and I did. And I got a paper, all those kinds of things. But if you're working in the visual system, at least then, the way it worked is perception of light by the visual system. So you had to work in the dark. So I would get up in the morning, pretty much as the sun was getting up, go to the lab and go into the dark room. Be in there all day long and come out at the end of the day triumphant that I had probably broken a couple of micropipettes, but I had gotten some data. That all felt great. But it was still dark outside because I had missed all the day. So after doing that for quite some time, I decided there must be something more to life than doing that. And happily, my tutor, perhaps my mentor, didn't abandon his interest in the visual system. So I gladly ceded that turf to him. Together we got a nice paper, but I moved on to other things. 2 other quick experiences, and the reason for going through these is not to make the point that when you think about them concatenated together, they're each very different. And I think perhaps the lesson here is there's a certain nonlinearity. There's a bit of opportunism, but the unifying thread is the interest in and the fun of discovery. What I didn't tell you in that social science team that led to my senior thesis, which allowed me to graduate, I was actually working that summer up in Ithaca. It's a great team to work with, and we made sure that we reviewed data every week, typically on Saturdays, starting at about 5 o'clock with a barbecue at one of our houses. And we had good food and adult beverage. It was a lot of fun. And, that sort of reinforced for me, this is something that I think I could really derive personal satisfaction with over time. 2 other experiences just to underscore the diversity. When I went to medical school, I was also involved in another research project. I'm sure you're all, or I hope you're all familiar with heart-lung bypass machines. You know, they put a couple of catheters in, they take your blood out, you oxygenate it through a membrane, and that actually is the basis now for heart-lung machines. And one of the questions at that time was, could you take that concept, move it beyond, you know, however, hopefully not many hours that you're on such a machine when you're having cardiac surgery, but for people who needed more sustained support, what are the ways to do that? Would that be workable? And I was actually one of the pair of hands that was on a development team developing a novel membrane oxygenator. So that, again, having been a social scientist, a biologist, a neuroscientist, I was now a pulmonary and heart-lung physiologist working on trying to develop systems to do that. Part of the reason I was invited to be part of that is obviously when you're on a machine like that, and these were not people, these were large animals, but you're on 24/7. And they needed someone to take the night shift. So I'd sort of be in charge with a couple of other people of the night shift. I'll tell you that it was a heck of a lot of fun because we had the head of that team, a guy named Phil Drinker, was really one of the pioneers in this area. The particular thing that we worked on never quite made it to reality, but that's okay. Oftentimes that doesn't happen. And maybe the last thing I'll mention is after doing medical school, we could talk about at least my experiences there, and then residency. I went to the NIH and became yet another phenotype. This time I didn't quite realize it, but I was on my way to becoming, to terminally differentiating, to becoming an immunologist and a clinical immunologist working on autoimmune disease. And there I had a chance to learn, be more directly involved in investigation in patients, because some of the still durable clinical trials in a disease called systemic lupus, that was the focus of the group at the NIH that I joined, and was one of multiple people contributing to those studies. Did another couple things there, some of them with that team, and then I was encouraged also to do to have initiatives on my own. Has anyone ever, are you aware of the effect of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs on the kidney? Yeah. Now, if you take you can cause a decrement in kidney function. It's actually a fascinating physiologic issue. Most of the time it's not expressed that way. Who had a view on this? That actually was something, that was the side project. The seminal paper making that observation came out of work in lupus because we sort of saw an effect that nobody understood at the time. And so the group I was working with, they said, why don't you look into that? And so that sort of took off to another direction of research, which was actually quite gratifying. I'd like to think it was that seminal paper and a whole series of follow-up papers that actually led to a multi-billion-dollar change in direction of Big Pharma. For those of you who might be aware of, if you've ever used Celebrex or meloxicam, they were designed because of those studies. Or at least that's the way we like to think about it. They probably think about it differently. I have, as I've thought about it, I have some sort of threads that I pulled out of this, but I think what I'd like to do is just stop here and ask you guys if you have any thoughts or questions about any of this, because you'll notice what I've talked about is a thread that goes back to perhaps when I was a slightly younger pup and haven't sort of concentrated on, gee, what did I do for the first 3 years of my career as a young faculty member, although I'm happy to talk about it. So any questions or comments you might have?
I guess, was there like any one moment that sort of put you on the path where you are today? Like, you went through your whole life, well, your whole life story, but from high school on, but what point really?
So that's about 20 years.
Are you asking for an influential person, moment, aha moment, or something? Or
Anything
any of
along
the
those
above?
lines, anything that, like, what was that sort of defining moment that pushed you towards this pathway here at UAB?
Yeah. I don't think there was a single moment. And one of the reasons I drew such a long path is it really represents the sort of continual build and reinforcement and build of an interest in a discovery. That's a lot of, I find that not only intellectually rewarding, but as you do it, and I've been very fortunate to have some teams that I've worked with that have been fun teams. I mean, those Saturday evenings at the very beginning, I can close my eyes and I can replay in my mind's eye almost every one of them. We just had fun, and we were doing some really cool things. And that was the kind of thing, since it was summer, we do that, and then we sort of had a very clear blend of what we were doing investigatively with what we were doing every day. And one of the reasons I suspect in retrospect, the leader of that team might have gotten us together at his house for a barbecue on Saturday night, because he knew he was going to send me off to the computer center a little bit later so I could get onto the machine, because that was in the day where you loaded cards on your big 360 systems. Now, a little bit different then. But to your point, Carlos, I think that the question of, was there a person that stands out? I'd like to introduce the concept that I'm sure you guys have thought about of role models. I think that's slightly different than the way we currently talk about mentors. And I'm not saying that one is right or one is wrong, but for me, I had the opportunity to see people along the way who were stimulating to be with, who were having fun doing what they were doing, and who enjoyed the exchange of, man, what could we do if we went this way? So it was a constant evolution, at least for me, of saying, I wanted, and I never knew this was happening. It's only in retrospect. I'd love to do that. I'd love to be able to have that kind of insight that might make an impact. Now, as I look at those role models that I encountered, their definition of impact was different than my current definition of impact. But the theme was the same, doing things that were sort of at the edge, and having fun doing it and enjoying that give and take. And I think that's the most important thing. So I'm going to add a little bit the distinction between that and that concept of role model and mentoring. And Jean and Jeff are going to smile at this. We get very transactional when we talk about mentors. And I do understand the value of the transactional component, which really means aligning expectations so that you're pulling in the same direction, perhaps with your mentor and your team. the examples I've given, that was done intuitively. And that's fine. But what I'm also suggesting is beyond those sort of transactional arrangements, for me anyway, there was something formative that went well beyond that. That was the sharing of that pleasure, that joy of, I'll call it the joy of discovery. I still love that. And Brian isn't here right now, but he'll know that in that context, we just uploaded UO1 to the NIH yesterday afternoon, which is taking a set of ideas that some might think a little arcane, a little basic in terms of human genetics, but taking it to, if we go here, we may be able to explain why some people don't respond to therapeutic monoclonal antibodies. And by the way, if that works, we can predict it. So then we know, we don't have to wait for the outcome and say, oh gosh, we can know in advance what to do and perhaps take a different course. It's, in many ways, obviously a different content area, but in many ways it's the same kind of thing that we've been trying, or at least I've been privileged to be a part of all along. Yeah.
I just make an observation that listening to some of these wonderful career journey talks, most people don't tend to spend a lot of time talking about their doctoral program or medical school. It almost seems to me that that's like a lock that you put a key into that opens up your options, but it's digging post holes or these people that you meet along the way that cause you to make these important years. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Every time that I hear one, it strikes me that that's what people tend to talk about, are relationships.
And could I flip a couple of your comments? You talked about medical school and perhaps a lock that's opening things up. I would encourage you to make sure that medical school isn't the lock that closes things down. One of the realities of professional school.
Just to be, for your comments, not everyone here has gone to med school or is going through med school. So we got social scientists and other people. I think you know that, but just your comments are applicable to other areas.
And I was about to change medical school to professional training because I think it's for all of us. And I think, and there's actually one of my 2 slides that I want to show you might pertain to this. As we focus on skill set acquisition, which is really important. If you don't have skills, it's a little challenging. But you have to make, my bias is you have to make sure that doesn't close down the breadth of your thinking. And that especially for medical school, but for other professional schools, it may be the same, or graduate programs, that the necessary completion of degree requirements, whatever kind of degree you may be pursuing, that's a necessary step, but I hope that doesn't get in the way of pursuing the passion. Because I hope underneath this you heard not only the word enjoyment or joyful, but there's a passion. And if we get too transactional, that can be extinguished. I'll tell you that I see that from time to time, and that saddens me greatly. Because the privilege we all have is to work in this space where I think it's a real privilege to be able to do it, because what we do, no matter what the perspective that we bring, can really make a difference. And I think that's very special. Yeah.
So I'm in graduate school right now, and I always feel that I'm kind of being asked the question of, what do you want to do in 10 years, in 20 years? Where do you see yourself? And a lot of people in my program, we kind of find ourselves like already starting to track ourselves towards being where I'm in psychology, so being a clinician, being a researcher, like an academic medical center. We're always kind of thinking ahead to that long-term goal that we're working towards. And I was just wondering, kind of from what you were describing, if you had an idea of kind of like your end point in mind, or if it was just kind of unfolding as you were moving through these different phases of your life?
Well, for discussions like this, I don't know whether the expectation is that, I am able to lay out a 15-year plan, but I didn't have one. I think there was sort of a commitment implicitly there. I hope it's clear that I enjoyed what I was doing. I worked really hard. None of this was passive. But it was taking advantage of opportunities that came up and always trying to think about how to weave them into a fabric. I really mean it. I was very privileged to have opportunities come up, so it wasn't the absence, it was sort of, where's the passion? But no, I didn't. It unfolded. I mean, that's part of the reason I wanted to go all the way back, because if you look at it from a disciplinary point of view, I probably worked in half a dozen different disciplines. I've been a pulmonologist, I've been an immunologist, a neurologist, I've been a sociologist, and I don't know what else. I think people call me a lot of different things, but in an academic sense, those might be some of them. Jeff, you had a comment.
Sort of touched on identifying the opportunities that you've been presented with and taking advantage. So for folks in the room that aren't aware, Dr. Kimberly not only directs the CCTS here at UAB, but he previously served as Division Director for Division of Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology, and I also believe a Senior Associate Dean here at the university. So Dr. Kimberly, not only from a scientific standpoint, has been very successful, but also in leadership here at UAB, moving through the career ladder, identifying the opportunities for leadership, and that's another aspect of his career journey, which we'll probably get into shortly. But knowing what are the best opportunities to move your career forward and transitioning from the midnight to 7 a.m. pulling out. I guess because you had done the darker work, they figured you were good being up late at night. That sort of thing later in your career. What made that transition? Also being a practicing clinician, which I think you still are today. So that's the question. So the question is, how did you identify? So you went from doing research, clinical trials, you were seeing patients regularly, to moving into a leadership roles. When did you decide, or how did you decide you wanted to transition to, I now want to lead the team as the division director, as a senior associate dean, and now as the director of the CC?
So I'll try to put it in the context of a similar kind of context I talked about before. I don't think there was a single moment at which I said, okay, now I'm going to be X, because it doesn't work that way, I don't think. But you probably sense that there's a breadth of interest. But one of the things that I've had the privilege of doing is building a number of teams, some of them quite large. I haven't talked about a international program to study the genetics of SLE, the human genetics of this particular disease. That actually started here. It started from some of our work, and we built a international consortium to do that. We did the same for end-stage renal disease, because that's one of the major consequences of lupus, and we're trying to figure out how could we get insights that might help us intervene more effectively. I raise that because, in the unfolding, there are times when you're sort of project focused, but times when one is also thinking about context. So it's project within context. And as one begins, or at least for me, as I began to appreciate context more and more, I began to realize that developing the answer to the questions raised by the context required an additional, and that's important because that UO1 we sent in yesterday is very project focused, but it required a larger context. It required a strategic development of a larger programmatic plan. And to the setup, which you very nicely wrote about, thank you. When I came as division director to UAB, to the division, it became clear to me that there was what I will call two contexts, sort of plural, that were ripe for building. So these another way I might call them is strategic directions to build. And I think we did that, but that required, in order to pull that off, it required the unfolding of some additional activities that we executed on. And as we were able to do that successfully, I think there were others in the institution whom I'd like to think said, gee, we could do more of that strategic program building. And so could you help us out with this? And again, that's sort of fun, at least from my perspective, because it involves understanding not only where things are currently in your science, but being able to look forward and around the corner, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. And when you can do that, there's an additional layer of opportunities to become available. Again, that's still thinking about some of those positions a little bit more strategically rather than just sort of operational. Yeah.
As you were beginning the first 5-10 minutes of the presentation,
Mm-hmm.
it took me back to high school happy places, to a lot of happy places throughout my professional career that continues to evolve. And then I look at the audience, and everyone was thinking, and say like, gee, what's going on in your mind? And as you open the floor to the trainees, we've heard from two. And I was wondering if, going back to your question, what questions do they have for you based on your
Sure.
and so forth, if they care to either ask and reflect, because those two comments were different,
Mm-hmm.
very important.
That's the opportunity for me to grab my mug of coffee, take a sip while you guys are thinking about some questions.
I'm reflecting on the 5-year, 10-year plan. I think what I'm gleaning from your talk and amongst the other career trajectory talks we've heard is that you sort of have to have the plan in mind to show that you're driven and have some sort of goal, but you also have to be very open to all the opportunities that come your way. So if you lock into your 10-year plan, then you're going to sort of become blinded to those and not see the opportunity to lead a team. Like have it, but be willing to throw it in.
And I think, if I could, it depends a little bit on what we mean by a 10-year plan. In a sense, I probably never seriously questioned the fact that I would be in academic medicine. So if, back when I was a medical student, if the question were put to me, it never was, but if it were put to me, do you envision yourself in academic medicine 10 years from now? Is that your plan? The answer would have been clearly yes. If then the next question came up, what are you going to be doing? I said, well, I don't know. And, some of the choices have been experience, have been opportunistic. Some were actually, in a sense, framed for me. Probably the most obvious was that when I went to the NIH, that spoke to that general, yes, I see myself going in that direction. But then within NIH at that time, I think still does, there was a match within the NIH Clinical Center as what programs you might work for. And you could express a preference, but you couldn't say this and only, well, you could have dropped out, but I didn't. And so that match was formative for me. If I had matched in a different way, I probably would be doing something different. I might be a pulmonologist for all I know. But I matched with the program then that was doing clinical immunology and autoimmune disease. I had the privilege of working with directly as a mentor and colleague, and then the division chief, both, I think I would look back and call them luminaries in the field. Again, when you're sort of pushing as a kid. But it was a privilege to work for those guys. And I would look at them and I would say, gee, I'd love to be able to do what you're doing. I would love to be able to do half of what you're doing. And they, in in retrospect, in their extremely wise way, it's that balance between guidance and open landscape that at least worked for me. So I don't know whether that represents a 10-year plan or not. So it's a little bit of both, if that's helpful. Other questions or thoughts?
I'm wondering about things you've said no to over the years that you may have helped put you on the path, that if any of those are instructive or deciding what to do.
So that's a really important question, John. And quite honestly, I'm not sure the word no has been used very often, at least explicitly. Implicitly, it has been. And probably the biggest one for those who are in whichever professional school, or it may be when, whatever your training domain, probably the biggest decision for me was, am I going to be, is my goal to become a full-time clinician? Or is my goal to work in clinical medicine as a physician scientist? And at least for those in medical school, that's a bifurcation in the road. It turns out in the context in which I came through at that point, that was not the context implicitly answered it for you. And that was, you are going to be a physician scientist. So there was a large contextual support for that in expectation. But effectively, I said no to, I'm not going down this particular road. So in that very macro level, there was a no. Now, how that maps to each of you, I don't know. But those are the kinds of conversations I could see now being useful to have, in part because context has changed a little bit. Those are the things that whomever you have relationships with, whether mentor or role model, peer colleague, or whomever, those are the kinds of discussions that are probably useful to have over coffee or whatever. In the early morning, it's probably coffee. But whatever it may be.
Yeah, I've got it's more a comment than a question. Is that
Sure.
You talk about role model and on the other hand, mentors. So the question is, what's for you the difference between a role model and a mentor? Because to me, it's like the role model is someone you will never criticize. Right? You never criticize a role model because you think that is a correct way of living. So it will drive you through a macro level, as you said. And the mentor is someone that you sometimes will criticize, you sometimes will talk with, you sometimes will, drive you from in a more strict way, like in the, the later phases of your career or something like that. What do you think about that? The question is basically, what's the difference between a mentor and a role model?
No, you're raising an important point. The role model is really someone perhaps that you would like to you see things in that person, probably not everything, but you see things in that person that you would love to be able to accomplish yourself. And maybe in this language, a mentor, or there is someone, let's not use the word mentor, there's someone who's being a little bit more transactional, and this is how you do this is how you do that. Those are not necessary, those can be embodied in the same person. They don't need to be embodied in the same person. And as I reflect, because we have a lot of these discussions about what should a mentor do, you probably sensed I tend to push back a little bit from the very transactional, because I think fundamentally it's the passion and the commitment that's going to support us through the ups and the downs, because they both happen. But both are helpful. As I reflect on my time, that that person who would help smooth the pathway, probably that was much less prominent. And man, as I look back, I sort of wish, gee, I wish I had a little bit, because just about every mistake you can imagine I've made. I probably didn't talk about that, but I have made it, and some of them would have been so simple to avoid. So I think there's a role for both kinds of things. And again, it's looking to your context and your environment to find both kinds of support. I think both are useful. And in fact, the role model needn't even be at the same institution. It could be someone who's within the field. What I have found most useful for me is that I've been fortunate enough that those role models, who in a sense have also been mentors, are a little bit less transaction oriented. They've all been direct personal relationships. And I think about them often. And I think about them in the context of, I know what might have happened in this circumstance. And sometimes I say to myself, gee, I hope I can do that to people I work with. And there are times I say, quite honestly, gee, I hope I don't do that to people I work with, because there's no one thing that's perfect. Yeah.
Your question in this conversation is expanding the horizon and role models. So one way that I interpret this is a mentor is to know you. Is to have back. You are the most important component, and this goes back to transaction, this and that. So a role model may not need to know that you even exist. Oftentimes they do. So for example, for me, the community is an extraordinary role model. He knows it exists. Please say yes. But we have not had any transaction on those components. You may have multiple role models. You say, like, gee, I want to do that. And yes, I'm going to get to know that person yourself, and I want the vice versa. You may have opinions. And you may say, I don't want to do that either.
Oh,
right?
And
So that the role models don't need to know you exist. I mean, to me, that's a tiny difference. In that area is that.
That's probably what I'm seeing. This is the, I don't know if I've tried is that a mentor is someone you get a relationship, and you get some can argue sometimes, like I'm saying something and the mentor is, no, that's not correct. A role model is someone who you aim to be like that. That's what I'm.
And again, I think to your point, that those roles need not be embodied in the same person, but sometimes they are. And one of my role models, going back to the NIH, who was also serving the more mentor model, we still get together for lunch at least once a year. Because these are national meetings, he wants to find out how, it's really cute, He wants to know how his guys are doing. Guys is a gender neutral term, but a lot of people have gone through his lab, and he wants to know. And one of the things that's taught me is whatever role you're taking, or the person who is the role model or the mentor, sometimes you know the influence you're having, lots of times you don't. And that sort of unfolds over time. And I think that's part of why Paul and a group of us try to get together. And all of us, at least some of us, do. We can't get everybody together all the time. It's sort of that exchange. From my perspective, there are a couple of things that come from that. Number one, frankly, is a thank you to Paul. I cannot say that enough times. Not sure I said that when we were together, but it's certainly something I've come to appreciate. It's also a learning experience for me, because then when we're sitting around talking about our own career paths and the influence that Paul had on all of us is sort of setting us in directions. There's a lot to learn from each other and from him. Yeah.
So picking up on another thing you talked about, so I think when we see very successful people, we tend to see their successes. So can you talk a little bit about influential things that haven't worked out and how that affected your career?
Sure, and I'm going to do it in two buckets. First of all, in the what I will call the project bucket, and then the expectation bucket. In the project bucket, as I'm sure you all know, some things work, some things don't. That's the nature of investigation. But there are both where relationships impinge upon projects, and then relationships impinge, or expectations. Let me distinguish between relationships and expectations. One of the things I've learned is that sometimes those projects have worked out because there hasn't been good alignment of relationships. That large international consortium that I referred to, I'd like to think on the whole it would be viewed as a success and recognized as such. You don't have to scratch the surface very much to see a lot of things that didn't work and that were very influential, not only in terms of the direction of the project, but frankly in how I view my relationship to that project in going on. In terms of expectations, to the question that Jeff set up in terms of, did you decide that you want to make a transition to a different position? Quite honestly, when I look at my career, there have been times when my expectations and my own sense of where things should go haven't matched. I'll call it broadly, and this is not just at UAB, but at other places I've been, have not matched with what I will call institutional expectations. And, you could call that an expected dynamic conversation and tension. But I haven't always viewed it personally that way. I've had the sense that perhaps the way I was suggesting might have been preferred. Certainly was preferred by me, but I'm quite sure it was not preferred by everybody. I don't know whether you call that lack of success or not. It's a process of trying to understand. And then what I would say is when those things have happened, and they do for virtually everybody, is to use that as a chance to sort of recalibrate and figure out where the next opportunity is going to be, and how that would not only serve your interests and your passion, but might also serve the context, whatever that context is that you're you're working in at the time. Has anyone ever heard of the metaphor red ocean, blue sea? It's used in a slightly different way. It's usually used in the context of business competition. But I'll use it, morph it just a little bit for this. If you view that mismatch of expectations, a red ocean, as you might imagine, refers to blood in the water. So maybe that's where there was a little bit of a clash. So what you do is you look for the blue sea where that's not there. What's the way around? What's the new opportunity? If you're a business strategic planner, that's the way you should be thinking. Actually, we have these discussions with our CCTF partner network, and we had Auburn up here on Tuesday because they're going through a strategic planning process. Fascinating. And we were, several of us with the CCTS have been invited to participate in the Auburn strategic plan. And so we had that kind of discussion of, where might you have lack of success, especially if you're thinking contextually, and where's the huge opportunity. So one of the things that we might always keep in mind, we're going to get no's. Sometimes it's a no that you decide. Sometimes it's a no that someone else decides. But to use that as the opportunity to think, okay, where's that blue sea? Where can we take it forward? Because it's always there. It may not always be evident, but it's always there. Yeah.
So I just got a question about general professional research trajectory. So one of my mentors once shared with me that she said that the best way is to develop a focus early on and just continue and deepen your experiences, publish and then focus in this area. But sometimes that's not happening this way. So like in my case, for example, I went through different experiences. If I did that, I should probably still work with mice, better than everybody see. That's what I was doing in secondary medical school. But I'm in a different area right now, health outcomes research. So I guess from your standpoint, so let's say me or someone else is interviewing for a junior faculty position. Someone asks a question, so why your research or professional experiences are so diverse? So how I would answer the question if I face it? From your experience.
Interesting. Can I put up a slide that's just going to be a backdrop because it speaks to that? And I promise you only two, and I believe that's true. Yeah. And I'm not gonna. Come on. One more click. So the slide was designed for something else, but it's pertinent. I think you've spoken to a critical tension that we all need to deal with. For all of us, we need to develop what I will call our disciplinary expertise. Sometimes one might conceptualize this as a project focus. And that's important. You have to do that. But if you focus solely on that disciplinary expertise, my bias is you're setting yourself up for difficulties maybe 5 or 10 years down the road. Because science doesn't stand still. So I think it's important. Again, this is my own perspective, and I've run into difficulties for exactly the same reason. Because when some people have asked for descriptions of what I've done for whatever reason, I can put down things we haven't talked about, but I can put down the comments I made about non-steroidal drugs and kidney function. that was actually a focus for me for a couple of years, and all of the literature comes from that. And then I can turn around and say an autoimmune disease, it was steroids, and we did receptor structure. And a comment I get back, usually implicitly, is, oh, well, where's your focus? But if science moves, you need to be able to think laterally at the same time you're thinking with a deep disciplinary expertise. So when you go on the job interview, you might think about something presented in this slide. This was the second of the two. It was designed to be presented in sequence, but since it's up there with all things, I consider the disciplinary expertise maybe like a carrot. You know, it's deep, it's focused. That's what you want, right in that niche, it's strong. In nature, there's another kind of root system. Carrot's called a taproot. In nature, though, the other root system is called the fibrous root system. That's lateral. Couldn't quite get a good picture off of the web for that because I wanted a little more lateral. But there are, you know, if you're into botany, you can think of those things. That's the lateral thinking. But one of the problems with plants that have that kind of system is they're frankly not as sturdy in some storms. And so some trees actually work, which is on your right. Yeah, you're right. They have both. They typically have a deep taproot, and then they have the lateral. I would call that disciplinary thinking as the taproot, and that more broad thinking, which allows you to see the interconnections. I'll come back to that very first project that was taking social science. I was the biologist, and I said, you know, could we think about it this way? That was the lateral. The data set was the taproot. We put it together. Not only did I get my thesis, which is probably the most important thing, that spun out, that was an undergraduate project that spun out to a paper in Nature, which is pretty atypical. But it was sort of getting, you see the T and the taproot and the fibrous root, and there's the pitch for translational science over there. Because I think it's those people who can think laterally as well, based on the disciplinary science. They make great team members for those transformative teams, and they keep your science anchored in skills and flexible to move with where the science is going. Now, how you handle that for a job interview probably is something separate, but I think it's my bias. I think it's extremely important. Other things. Yeah.
It's been your learning style. What is your learning style?
You mean, do I learn by reading or talking or? Is messy an acceptable learning style? So I would say that what I probably do best, I'm a combination of an oral, A-U-R-A-L, and visual learner. That doesn't mean I don't read. My wife would say I've got more than a few papers stacked up at home, and that's why I'm relegated to the basement, by the way. But also in my office. Where I do best, I've learned, is in discussion with people. So it's an oral, visual, give and take work. I use the metaphor of working at the whiteboard. And I had gotten a reputation of actually walking around UAB, finding conference rooms with empty whiteboards and filling them up. One of my challenges is I was doing this before the iPhone was there to take pictures, and so I tended to leave them up. And so I got a bit of a reputation of making whiteboards messy, I'll say. But to me, that's the iterative learning where, and it's not just myself with a whiteboard. Sometimes is a to set up the discussion it is, but it's getting a couple of people around and working at the whiteboard and finding out, what does this mean? What does that mean? You know, that kind of thing. So that's both a learning and an implementation style. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story. One of the things that really stuck out to me was your emphasis on joy and the experience of joy at various stages in your journey and how formative that was for you. So I'm just curious if you have tips or lessons learned about ways that you can kind of keep that focus on joy in your professional life, given all the other requirements and responsibilities that people have at various stages.
Gosh, I think it's an exceptionally important question, and I wish I had a really good answer to that. I think it is, my bias is it's an important thing, not only for those of us doing the work, but for the mentor, when the mentor is taking on a more supervisory role. And it's what I drew from my role models. Now, in a perfect world, those two things are pretty overlapping. So I can see someone who's really enjoying what they're doing, and they're also helping me figure out how to do it. I think it's important to intentionally carve out time for the kinds of discussions, and here this comes to both my learning and my implementation style for those conversations. And for all of us, no matter what our profession, you know, there's so many pressures on time that actually those discussions have, it's hard to preserve that. But I think it's critically important. So some of you have asked, well, what's working and what's not working, what hasn't worked? One of the goals actually in the CCTS is to be able to create forums for that, and we have not succeeded in there. This is such a high-revving, time-pressured institution that I still haven't solved that problem. I personally think it is critical because it is that perspective. Have any of you had experiences in your career so far where something hasn't worked, or you've gotten some negative feedback? Or has it all been positive up till now?
In publications, it's very hard to publish without reading articles. So a lot of reviews, for example, were negative to my papers.
Yeah, it hurts, doesn't it? I always give myself about 48 hours to verbalize whatever I think about that without too much constraint. But then the promise, not only to myself, but to the others involved, to say, okay, you get 48 hours to fuss or whatever it may be. And then after that, okay, what's next? How are we going to do it? Because typically, even after all that fussing, there's probably some truth in some of those comments. And sometimes people have missed the point, and it's always a mix. So I wish I had the answer. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's one of the things we are striving to work on, this forum being one of them, where we can share both successes and things, frankly, that aren't successful, because that happens. So we can mutually say, yep, it happens, but guess what? You press on and it works out. Hopefully also from a project and innovation perspective, to share some of that excitement. My own bias, though, is we as an enterprise need more of that. And as you guys have ideas for that, please let me know. Because I would love to try to be more successful in doing that. Because one of the challenges I have, I think we all have, as one goes through a career arc, the pressures don't get less. I'll just say they don't get less. And so I don't know if any of you looked around and seen some less than fully happy faculty. Yeah, if you don't say yes. That concerns me because I still believe we have a privilege of doing whatever our discipline is. We have a privilege to do some stuff that's rare. And we're entirely committed to trying to figure out how not to squeeze out that joy as one goes through the career arc. Simple to say, really hard to do. And at 5 o'clock, I could go on a great length about that. But thank you for asking the question. And I'm serious, I would welcome suggestions as to what we do, wherever we are on the career. Yeah.
I'm thinking about all this, and I think one of the challenges around being in academic medicine is the highs are quite high and the lows are very low. So, one day you'll get an award at a conference for doing this great thing, and the next day you'll get a job rejection or a grant rejected or not discussed, and it's just difficult cognitively to wrap your head around those different experiences. And one day you're on top of the world, and the next day you feel like a failure. I'm curious how you sort of navigated those ups and downs, and what your advice would be to the faculty members or postdocs or graduate students that are trying to make sense of these experiences.
So I think one of the most important things is in navigating the lows. I don't think in navigating the highs is so much the problem. I think it's probably the other.
Don't get too full of yourself.
Well, that actually is really important, because no matter where you are, there will be lows, no matter how many highs you've had. And but I think that's where contacts and colleagues come in. When there's the forum, whether it's the coffee pot, I personally love the coffee pot metaphor, because I got more work done at the coffee pot waiting for that next cup, that next pot to brew. But some people use a water cooler metaphor. You've heard me allude to 5 o'clock. It's all the idea of getting together with colleagues. And part of the navigation of that low is everybody's done it, we've been there. And they're all still here and they're all still working. And so it's okay, give yourself 48 hours. Say whatever you need to say, some of which I wouldn't repeat. And then, get up and get going. But also not reject the lows, especially when, might be a grant or a paper. At least when that has happened to me, among the things I usually say in the first 48 hours is how incompetent the reviewers were. I try to limit it just to their competence, but sometimes I assassinate their personalities and everything else. That doesn't get you past the low. So if that's what you need to do, go right ahead and do it. But then seriously, take a step back and say, okay, what was being said in the review that is actually substantive? Because there's always something that's substantive. I think there are very few malignant reviewers. Sometimes they miss the point, but maybe that means I didn't explain well. And so then I have to step back and say, okay, why is this, which is so obvious to me, why wasn't it obvious to them? Because of course, if it was obvious to them, they would have given it a 1. So what's the disconnect? And I think giving yourself the time to ventilate a little bit, it's just important to acknowledge that. But then drawing on your colleagues are two of the things that at least that I've done. And then try not to take the character assassination of reviewers beyond 48 hours, because you'll probably be meeting them at your next meeting. And they may end up being colleagues. So can I know we're close to the bottom of the hour. Can I show you the other slide? And both these slides were used actually at the beginning of CTSTP. Did anyone see them? Anyone in the CTS? Okay. Now you have to take this other one in the context. Let's see, maybe trying to figure out how to go backwards here without revealing. Darn it. So you've seen it. There was, this is in the context of what's a successful translational investigator. I think it's successful investigators are translational. Because if they're not, they're focused, they're disciplinary, they are just like that taproot. And when science moves a little bit to the side and they're still in the same niche they were, they will find out that science has moved past them. I'll leave it at that, but I suspect during your, even up till now, you've seen some cases where that may have happened. That's pitch number one for translational science. With the group, I've talked about a couple of things, and I'm just going to zip through them. In terms of characteristics of a successful translational investigator. I hope together we've talked a little bit about imagination and intellect. And I use metaphors a lot there, looking for parallels in other structures. Just curiosity. That's why I started in high school. That's where the curiosity, and I didn't know it at the time, but that's at least for me where that became evident. And I realize now, you know, we probably all have family stories to talk about. But I can remember as probably not even as a high schooler expressing some fun about, because I was taking biology 1 or whatever it was, most likely 9th grade or something. And my dad and my older brother sort of joking about how much fun I was having about throwing some stuff. That was actually, and that was all very fondly meant. But as I thought about it, what I didn't realize is that's where I was expressing the joy of the curiosity and the discovery. And I think I've been lucky enough to carry that through. Couple of other things. This is actually drawn from a book, and you've seen the picture about who it is. Span of multiple disciplines. Intentionally now in the CCPS, we're trying to emphasize being multilingual, going across different disciplines. That doesn't mean you have to do it all, but you at least have to know how to talk with people with different disciplines. It's a major challenge. One that, frankly, our community of investigators doesn't fully embrace. You know, it's the difference between the me, where the M is like that, and the we, where it's like that. And that's always a bigger challenge, and maybe you've experienced that. I still experience that. Something that might be particularly timely in these days, I think it's important to recognize there are facts, or at least to the best of our ability. So observing carefully and recording, I think, is important, at least recording up here. And avoiding silos, collaborating. And I think there's one more. This is my favorite. It gets to the question you had about learning styles. For me, when you look at my desk, it's frankly an embarrassment because it is an ocean of paper and notes. I frustrate my better half by actually knowing where almost everything is. I have an archaeologic map of what's on the desk, different learning styles, but part of it is lists. It's lists of ideas, and these are, it's really, in retrospect, what I'm doing is I'm or not so rapid as the case may be, prototyping ideas in directions to go in. And in this particular book, the author, describing perhaps a translational investigator of the past, pointed out that you also need some time to let things marinate. It's a little bit different than the current, at least popular way of thinking about Silicon Valley with rapid prototyping. How fast can you go? That's great for something very transactional, but if you're actually incubating creativity, sometimes it needs a little time to be nurtured. So I've been known to do the procrastination bit. So that's why I actually like that. And I think distraction, you can't do it so you don't get things done. But I view distraction as something that could be thinking laterally relative to the disciplinary comments that you made. So these are all characteristics of a translational investigator that came from a book named Walter Isaacson. And I hope, at least as you think about investigation and development of careers, none of these things would surprise you. Is that fair to say? Do you know who the investigator was that Isaacson was writing about? You may not have recognized the picture. Let me end with this. And you may not recognize it still. Do you know who that is? It's Leonardo Davinci. One of the, if you have a chance, two things. If you like, if you read, and I sort of am an oral visual person, so I have lots of books on my desk that are not read, but I sort of flip through and pick little pieces from. If you like to read, though, this is a good book for two reasons. Number one, it's huge, so if you need to do some weightlifting exercises, it's right there. The second is there's some interesting insights into what a polymath he was. And these are the characteristics that Isaacson distilled after writing this 600 pages about Da Vinci, that he thought characterized his career. So just things to think about. And wondering, are there ways that you might in yourselves nurture this? And again, if you have, as you have ideas for what we might do in the CCTS to help facilitate this, please let us know. We're happy to try lots of different things. Not everything works. We have a list of things that have worked fantastically. We have a list of things that haven't. But we're willing to try because that's what I think is so important. So I hope our time this morning has been helpful to you guys. Certainly it's fun for me, and insofar as you have suggestions, please let us know. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.